All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday, the day before Friday. Almost there. So close. We had sort of a teaser weekend or a fake weekend or just a day off or whatever you want to call it yesterday, but I hope everyone got some relaxation in and maybe got some work done and maybe got to sleep in a bit and, you know, things that days off are good for. Papers are due tomorrow, yes? Yeah? Oh, I have to pay less attention to that deadline than you do, so I can forget about it. Right, so papers are due tomorrow. How'd the quiz go on? Pretty bad?
Yeah, like the first two questions was like, what?
First two were like, what the heck?
Shit.
Anna, how'd it go?
Yeah, first one, I just couldn't remember it.
Oh. I was kind of thinking that when I put it on there. I was like, I wonder if this is a little too detail-y or not.
Yeah,
But
make it like a bonus question.
it was what?
I guessed it.
You guessed it? Did you guess it right?
Yeah,
You guessed it right? Okay.
I think. I don't know. I hope I explained it right.
Okay.
Make it a bonus. Make it a bonus.
I have a feeling it might be a slightly tricky question, but we'll see what people say, and then I'll figure out what to do with it. Right. Okay. Let's jump in. So, not yesterday, Tuesday, we were talking about First Nations people in Canada and kind of their experience and history and how it has come to be that they've essentially wound up on kind of the bottom of minoritized groups in Canadian society, even though as little as a few hundred years ago, this was their place, right? This was their land, the land that they first came to thousands of years ago and developed cultures here. And yet, we said that things changed pretty rapidly for them once white Europeans started to arrive, right? And so we kind of talked through a little bit of, that originally we had a fairly equal relationship. We had European traders and explorers coming here and trading with indigenous people. But of course, they brought disease with them, which started to devastate indigenous populations over the next couple hundred years. But also, as more and more Europeans came here, and as Canada came to be a kind of legal reality as a country, Canada as a country started to take steps to kind of push indigenous people aside, right? They were kind of very inconveniently located in a mass of land that the Canadian government wanted to turn into one country, right? We saw the map of Canada, and Canada was just that little bit kind of around the St. Lawrence River and a couple of provinces out east. But the Canadian government wanted all of this land for themselves, for this country. And again, they were successful in doing that, but in order to accomplish that goal, they needed to marginalize indigenous people, right? And so, of course, there were kind of social constructions or stereotypes and prejudices created around indigenous people. Probably some of the first stereotypes were that they were savages, right? That they were barbaric, that they were godless, that they were, these kind of slightly less than human wild people living in the woods, right? And to European eyes, it was easy to see them that way. Indigenous people certainly had a much simpler, their technology was much more simple as compared to Europeans who had, guns and ships and all kinds of things and compasses. Their technology was certainly more simple, as was their subsistence strategy, the way they got food. And so they simply went out into nature and hunted it or fished for it or gathered it. And so in some ways they had a very kind of simple way of relating to the land, and whereas Europeans had a very complex way of relating to land and to resources. But of course that led to ideas that, again, these people were not as intelligent or simple. They, of course, we said they didn't use a written script. They didn't write anything down, and so it was very easy for Europeans to see them as not capable of developing written language, which of course is not the case, written language comes out of certain political and economic situations. It doesn't have to do with intelligence. If you don't need to write anything down, you don't develop a written language, right? And if you need to write something down, then it gets developed. And if you take comparative cultures next term, we'll explain that. So it was very easy for Europeans to kind of look down on these people as, again, simple savages, as godless, as, naive of the ways of the world, all these kinds of things. And so the Canadian government took steps to kind of push these people aside. And so they settled more and more kind of white Europeans in the land that is Canada. They built a railroad across it. They slaughtered all of the buffalo, which of course were also inconveniently in the way of these farming communities. Again, you can't have a successful farm with millions of bison running all over the place, right? They'll flatten your entire farm and leave you with nothing. So all these things are kind of pushed aside, and the Indigenous people are pushed aside as well. This kind of leads to the signing of treaties, agreements that Indigenous people think is going to serve as the basis of relationship between the government and Indigenous people. They kind of go into it thinking, okay, this is an equal partnership, an ongoing relationship. We'll continue to negotiate. We'll continue to figure out the relationship as we go on. But again, for the Canadian government and their agents, it was really more of a sale of land negotiation, right? They thought their goal was to buy the land and to put Indigenous people kind of in a separate plot of land off out of the way somewhere, so that kind of white Europeans or white Christians could have the country of Canada that they wanted, right? And again, they got their way, right? They had the technology, they had the numbers, and they took the steps to, again, damage the way of life of Indigenous people so that they had to. They simply had no other choice. Eventually, we said that this relationship comes to be encoded in the Indian Act here, which is a legal document that serves as the basis of the relationship between the Crown or the Canadian government and Indigenous people. We said that the first versions of this act were pretty highly racist and discriminatory. And so the act went about to put restrictions on Indigenous people to make sure that they weren't able to govern themselves, they weren't able to identify themselves in terms of saying who was or was not Indigenous or who was not a status Indian. If you're a status Indian, then you get the benefits from the government that they've promised you, which are not as great as you might think, but they exist. I don't know all of them. You may, let me see. Some of the biggest ones that come up in the media that people misunderstand, they do have rights to hunt and fish on their traditional land for subsistence purposes. And so us white people, if we want to go deer hunting, we need a deer hunting license, right? And you go to the Fish and Wildlife Office and you buy a deer hunting license, and you'll get a license, and the license says you may shoot one deer of this sex, of this size, if you can. And if you can't, then you don't get to shoot any deer. Indigenous people are allowed to, on their traditional lands, shoot as many deer as they want, as long as they are using them for subsistence. So they can't go and set up, a deer meat store and start shooting all the deer and selling them for their own profit. So if it's part of their kind of traditional life and subsistence, they may hunt the deer without a license. Another one that gets a lot of attention, and I'm no expert on all of this, is taxes. And so some people believe that Indigenous people in Canada pay no taxes. And that's not true. The tax thing for them is that if they make their living on their reservation, on their traditional land that they have, if they make their living there and they earn their money there, then they do not have to pay federal income tax, as far as I'm aware. But most of these, good morning, most of these reservations are way out of town. They're like, way off in the bush. There's really nothing there, and there's not really a way to make any money there for the most part anyway. So most indigenous people who want to earn a living have to leave the reservation and, come into a city or, into the oil fields or work somewhere else. So it's, it sounds nice, but if you can't make your living on the reservation, it doesn't matter. And then they just pay income tax like the rest of us do. So there's a few other things as well, but they're not quite as, the benefits you get are not quite as fantastic as a lot of people think. And a lot of people think, oh, there's free money from the government and they don't pay taxes and they just do whatever they want, and it's not really the case.
I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard that indigenous people can buy tobacco, drugs, and alcohol with no taxes.
Let's see.
Yeah, I've heard it somewhere. I don't know if it's true.
I suspect that they can buy those things without tax if they buy them on the reservation. And so lots of people, I think there are, I think I've heard stories of people who have reservations close to the US border, driving across the border, buying a bunch of cheap cigarettes, driving back, and then selling them on the reserve for fairly cheap because they don't have to pay taxes to the government on those. And so you get them for cheaper as well. But again, they have to be bought on reservation, right? If you're living here in Vancouver, pretty inconvenient if you have to go all the way to the reservation to buy this stuff. So again, it sounds good, but it's really not that great. I don't think anyway. If you told me I could, get status tomorrow and then I would have those benefits, I don't know that I'd be too, I wouldn't be too excited to get them. I wouldn't go out of my way. But as an Indigenous person, there are other considerations as well, right? In particular, the consideration that these agreements were made and they should be honored, right? Especially because Indigenous people have wound up kind of marginalized in society. It's only fair to want what you've been promised, even if what you've been promised is not fantastic. It's reasonable to ask for what you deserve, right? So for me, because I'm a white person, it's very easy for me to say, oh yeah, I don't want them, whatever. That's very easy for me to say, but as an Indigenous person, it's different, right? It has to do with not only the benefit but also respect, and with acknowledging that those things are owed to your people, right? So there's extra layers if you're an Indigenous person that if you're a white person you don't have. Right. So the earlier versions of this law were very racist and discriminatory, and so at one point Indigenous people couldn't leave their reserve without permission from the Indian agent, who was a government worker. They couldn't appear in public in their traditional clothing, in their traditional dress, without a permit. They couldn't practice any of their rituals or ceremonies. They were barred from going places and acquiring things. Good morning. And so all of these things, and again, all of these things were encoded in the Indian Act, and they only applied to Indigenous people, right? They didn't apply to people that looked like me. And again, the whole purpose of this was to assimilate Indigenous people, to get them to somehow abandon or forget their culture, or to keep their culture from being transmitted from generation to generation, right? And we saw that. We said that the Superintendent of Indian Affairs here, Duncan Campbell Scott, said he's purposely trying to get rid of the Indian question or Indian problem. He's trying to get rid of these people. He's not even hiding it, right? He's not even dressing it up in fancy language. He's saying, we want to get rid of this problem. And the problem is that the people are there and they don't want them to be there. Okay, so again, whenever you hear, the Jewish question or the Indian question or the whatever question, the question is, how do we get rid of these people that we don't want here? That's always the question. And again, in this case, we're going to see the Canadian government try to assimilate Indigenous people so that they become like us, right? So that their culture disappears, that all of those promises that we made to them don't matter anymore because there won't be any status Indians to sort of give anything to, and that they'll basically be gone, right? That's what's going on here. Yeah, and we said that one of the other things that the Indian Act did was create these residential schools, right? And again, this was a treaty a treaty promise. Indigenous people had asked for schools, right? Again, they knew that their kids were going to require different skills to survive in kind of the white man's world, if you will, and they didn't have those skills. And so they said to the government, hey, in our agreement, we want you to set up schools and we want you to provide education for our kids so they can be successful in this new Canada that you're creating here. And again, it got signed into the treaties, but what these Indigenous people got was not what they were asking for and not what they thought they were promised, right? So again, these schools were boarding schools. They were set up hundreds of kilometers away from where these kids came from, and they were pretty brutal, right? Again, most of them were run by churches or church organizations, and they gave students a very basic education. So not the kind of education that would get you into university, the kind of education that taught you to read and write so that you could follow orders, right? And then you could sort of have the sort of lowest level of jobs in society. None of these schools was meant to turn out university graduates, right? They were all just a basic level of education so that these people could get the lowest level of job in society. And in concert with that, they got a crappy education and they got a huge amount of physical and emotional and sexual abuse to go along with it. And so the estimates are about 30% of Indigenous kids wound up going to residential schools. And again, about 6,000 kids die. I'm almost positive that that's a low number. I'm guessing that records weren't kept perfectly. I'm sure that kids ran away and they just said, oh, ran away. And I'm sure the kid died and they never found them. So I'm sure that's a low number. And again, the correct number here is 0, right? The correct number of kids that should die at school is 0. Not 1, not 6,000, nothing, right? And so these are kind of a brutal thing. And again, you can't do these sorts of things to basically an entire generation of people. Well, a number of generations, because the schools first open up in the early 1900s. The last Indian residential school closes, I think, in 1991. And so you cannot do this to multiple generations of kids and then expect that nothing is going to come of it, right? That as soon as you close the schools, well, glad we solved that, right? It's not how it works, right? You cannot brutalize people and expect there to be no generational trauma, right? You can't expect that the bad stuff ends there, and it echoes through, right? And so, again, lots of these, horrible punishments traumatize these kids, which of course they would traumatize anybody. And again, the purpose of this was to basically sever the lines of cultural transmission. And so these kids were punished anytime they did anything that was cultural, right? Whether they did their hair in a certain way, they had to cut their hair, right? We saw, sorry, I'm just going to jump back here. Look at this little guy here who shows up in the Regina, that's in Saskatchewan, Regina Indian Residential School in 1874. He shows up in his traditional clothing and his traditional haircut, and that's him, right? And then he's taken into school and he's turned into a white kid, basically, right? White kid haircut, the clothes. He's given a new name, Thomas Moore. Does that sound like an indigenous name to you?
So white.
That's a Christian name, right? Thomas Moore is a saint. And so he's given a white person's name. And again, if he does anything that is related to his original culture, whether he speaks his language or sings a song or prays or anything like that, he's going to be pretty severely punished, right? So again, these schools are trying to cut that line of enculturation or socialization, right? And if you do, then the culture disappears, right? Especially because there's no way of recording it. They don't write anything down. Everything is up here. And so if you stop people from teaching their culture, culture will die, right? That's true for any culture, right? If you stop teaching it, it will die. And that was the intent here. We read this. Did we read this?
Yeah.
Okay. Pardon me. We did read this on Tuesday, right? And I asked you some questions in connection to it, and it was kind of we were talking about the argument, right? The argument that was in this article. Is that what we were talking about? Let me just check my slides here, just so I know what's coming next. Okay, so it was that. Oh yes. So I asked you what's the author's argument in this article? Why might people want to reject it? Consequences for believing or not believing. Okay, I remember. All right. So I know this is going to be tricky because we haven't seen this article for a couple days. Do you remember what the conclusion of this article was? Or should I give you 5 minutes to just look it over? Okay, just take 5 minutes and look the article over again. Of course, it's in Microsoft Teams if you're online. Just look it over again very quickly so that you can refresh your memory, and then we'll talk about it, okay? So I'll just put 5 minutes on the clock here, and we'll do that. Okay, ready, Shreddies? Ready? Okay. Who wants to take a shot at this argument for me? What do you think Pamela Palmater's argument is?
We have to end the genocide against indigenous people and restore justice in Canada.
Okay, so Kang says the conclusion of this article is that we must end discrimination and racism against Indigenous people in Canada and restore justice?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, what do we think about that?
But also discrimination against Indigenous people can be called genocide.
Right, okay, so there's the idea that what has happened to Indigenous people in Canada over the past several hundred years should be called genocide, right? So there's this call to action, right? This call for justice and equality. There's the idea that what has happened to Indigenous people in Canada should be labeled a genocide. What else do we have? Right. So Canada needs to embrace or accept their non-Indigenous Canadians need to accept what has happened to Indigenous people in Canada in the past, right? Indigenous people definitely accept it because they know. Non-Indigenous people need to come to terms with what's happened here, right? What else do we have here to deal with? Okay. So I think I did something like this on Tuesday, but maybe I'll try and stitch it all together again. So if I stitch this together and said that what happened to Indigenous people in the past and what continues to happen to them in the present should be considered a genocide, right? And then I think there's a couple premises there, but maybe at the end, as a result, based on that argument, there's a call to action, right? The idea that we need to do something, right? So action needs to be taken to restore justice and equality for these people. So I think I'd like to take your thing and put it at the end, because sometimes that's what you do with an argument, right? You say, hey guys, we have a big problem here. This is the problem. This is why it's a problem, 1, 2, 3, but here's what we can do. Or here's how I think we should solve this issue, right? So sometimes you see things structured that way, and I think we could probably structure this one the same way as well. If we go with the idea that what happened to Indigenous people in the past and present should be considered a genocide, if that's the conclusion, as good critical thinkers, we should say, well, why? Pamela, why should we believe that what has happened in Canada is a genocide? What makes this a genocide? Right? A lot of Indigenous people killed or were killed or died in the process of the creation of Canada. That's true. Okay, so they were traumatized, right? Physically and emotionally and sexually abused, right? Hey, Gordon, that's an important piece. What else? Right. They tried to bring about the end of this group by kind of severing that process of enculturation, right, or interrupting it. They did. How do we know that all those things add up to genocide?
Torturing,
Huh?
torturing, killing.
Yes, but how do we know that those? So maybe this thing is part of Pamela's argument, right? So maybe the first premise is actually this, basically the definition of genocide, right? So she's saying what happened to and still happens to Indigenous people in Canada today should be considered a genocide. Well, why should we believe that, Pamela? Well, first of all, here's what a genocide is, right? A genocide is killing a particular group or imposing living conditions that seek to bring about the physical destruction of these people, or preventing births, or forcibly transferring children out of that group to another group, right? And so the second premise is probably what you've just been telling me, the idea that the Canadian government has done all of these things, right? People have been killed, people have been put into reserves, people have had their way of life destroyed, right, with the buffalo. Kids have been sent to residential school in order to basically kill their culture, if you will. Preventing births, has that happened? Yeah, right. The article talks about that some Indigenous women were sterilized, right? And so we didn't talk about that, and to be honest, I don't know a whole ton about that, but that's happened too. Have children been forcibly transferred out of their group into another group?
They were taken at a very young age and they didn't have to say, and none of their parents also like had to, like they can't say that I don't want my kids to go to residential school.
Right. So residential school is implicated in this last one, right? Because children were legally required to go to this school, and these schools were hundreds of kilometers away from their families and their friends and their land. And secondly, and I don't talk about this much, I don't have any slides on it, but something called the 60s scoop. And so what began to happen in the 1960s is that the Canadian government became more involved in child protective services. And so I'm not sure how aware you are of these, but they're usually a government agency. And what they do is they look out for the welfare of kids, right? So there are social workers that work for the government, and if they're, let's say your next door neighbor, let's say that they have, there's a parent with 2 kids, and let's say the parent is, a drug addict and they're abusive and they're passing out in the front lawn and the kids are not being taken care of, you can call, in fact, you are supposed to call Child Protective Services and say, hey, I think these kids are in danger, I think you should investigate. And so Child Protective Services will come, they will investigate, they'll see what's going on, and if absolutely necessary, they'll actually remove the kids from that home and put them in foster care if they're unsafe or if the parents are completely unable to care for them, right? And so again, it doesn't happen all the time, but some people are just not equipped to have kids. They have drug or alcohol problems, or they have a mental health issue, and it just makes the home just entirely unsafe for the children. And so the government will actually remove them and put them into foster care to make sure that they're safe. However, as a result of all of these traumas that many Indigenous people experienced, there were a lot of Indigenous homes that had a lot of trauma in them that were replicated, right? So there was lots of drug and alcohol abuse, there was lots of physical abuse. Sexual abuse is a thing that often repeats itself, and so sometimes people who were sexually abused as kids go on to sexually abuse others when they grow up. And so a lot of these things kind of echoed as a result of residential schools. And so lots of Indigenous kids in the 60s and after were removed from homes that were unsafe, but then they were placed into white homes, right? And so these kids grew up not really knowing anything about their Indigenous heritage or culture because they had been taken from a home that, probably was unsafe for them, but they weren't put into a home with their own people. They were put into a home of different people. And so, again, I'm getting a little off track here, but I think that's the second premise, right? The first premise is that this is what genocide is, and the second premise is that the Canadian government has done all these things, right? Boom, 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 right? And so we need to see what's happened here as a genocide because it fits it fits the it fits the description as created by the UN, right? What do you think about that? Well, maybe okay. That's too broad a question. Let me ask you. Let me ask you the second question here. Why might people want to disagree or not believe this argument? Why might people reject this argument?
They're ashamed to like say that Canadians or like white people actually were like that easy. And it's like a topic that is like a sensitive topic to talk about to some. And it might, and like Canada has always had this reputation of being like a nice country and all that.
Sure.
But like in reality, back then, like people weren't that nice, and they came here, like not ruining, but like kind of disrupting how the indigenous people were, and
Mhm.
like they just controlled that.
Yeah, it's true. So, number one, this is a sensitive topic and an unpleasant topic, right? Nobody likes to talk about the physical and sexual abuse of kids and the destruction of a culture. Nobody really enjoys talking about that. But secondly, Canadians have come to see themselves and like to and like others to think that we're nice, right? That's one of the stereotypes about Canadians, right? That we're nice, that we're polite, that we like hockey and maple syrup and saying A and all that stuff, right? But one of our stereotypes is that we're a nice country that welcomes other people, right? That welcomes other cultures and religions. And again, that might be to some degree true in the present, but it hasn't always been, right? And so we have this kind of very ugly chapter or series of chapters in our history that people might not want to think about or engage with, right? Why else might people want to reject this argument?
Technically, if you think about it, this current generation did do that stuff. But if they accept that they have to act and do things to make up for their ancestors' problems.
Right, and kind of what you're saying there, Avera, is you're saying that people will have to acknowledge their privilege. Is kind of what you're saying, right? Is that if people believe this argument, now they have to do something, right? Now you can't ignore it anymore. Now it's like, okay, something has to be done, right? You have to, and you have to come to terms with the fact that you are, maybe you're not the good guy in this story, right? And that's very true of me, right? I'm living in a country now where I benefit from the fact that Indigenous people were marginalized. Though their suffering has benefited me. And again, this is the tricky thing about prejudice and discrimination and dominant groups. It doesn't matter if I agree with it. It doesn't matter if I like it. It doesn't matter if I try not to make it happen. It still happens anyway. And it's true. Me and my ancestors had no direct part in this at all. Like most of my family came to Canada in the early 1900s. They were office workers, and actually my grandfather worked in a meat packing plant, cutting up meat for 40 years. But we didn't do any of this stuff, right? Like I don't have any connection to any of these awful things that happened. None of my family didn't do any of this stuff, right? But still, I am now living in a system that benefits me because they suffered, right? Because they lost, I get to benefit. And so that's an uncomfortable feeling for most people to acknowledge. And it is an uncomfortable feeling, and it should be an uncomfortable feeling. But some people, it takes work. It takes work to be able to get there, unfortunately. And some people either don't want to do the work, or are scared of it, or yeah,
So depressing.
super depressing.
Yeah, but when you go deep and just read some things that people who have suffered and written,
Sure.
it's just
Yeah, it's horrific, right? It makes you just want to go on like Instagram and forget about the whole thing, right? Um, but it's true, right? It's horrible what has happened to these people, and yeah, and it needs to be acknowledged. But acknowledging it is not easy, and it's not enjoyable or fun, right? And so I think in part that's some of the things that we're seeing in the States with the Black Lives Matter movement. People who want to push back against it, I think, are having that exact battle. They don't want to acknowledge how they have benefited from the fact that Black Americans have suffered, right? And again, that's the first step. If you can't simply say that yes, these things happened and they disadvantaged your people and they advantaged my people, and they still advantage me today. If you can't get there, then nothing else can really happen, right? You have to be able to make the first step and say, yes, this happened, and it continues to have a legacy. It continues to disadvantage you, and it continues to advantage me. And it doesn't matter if you like it or not, right? It doesn't matter if you like the fact that you have privilege or if you don't. None of that matters, because it's how society operates. And so, yeah, the first step is being able to get there. But that's not an easy step. And for me, it wasn't an easy step either. It took a while to kind of sort through the feelings and the defensiveness and the awfulness, and I'm probably not done, but I've made steps. And so, yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, but it has to be done. Why else might people want to reject this argument?
Understanding, yes, it's still very different. Their ideas are still different. Like, we live in a capitalist country and society, and we still don't understand how you can't own land, things like that. So difference in ideas and way of living probably is you might want to reject it as well, because I was mentioning about
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're almost talking about kind of like a culture clash thing, where not only is there this kind of ugly history and unequal relationship, but these two cultures really are different in very significant ways. And we've only just scratched the surface of what Indigenous culture is like, but you almost couldn't find two, if we can just call like Western European culture, if we can just call that one thing, you almost couldn't find a bigger difference between two cultures in the way that they think about the world and the land and family and work and resources and values and all of those things. You almost couldn't find two more different cultures than these two. And so they are really, in the past, hundreds of years ago, and even in the present, they're really speaking different languages, right? Many Indigenous societies had, they didn't own land. They shared everything that they had very strong family ties. Women are very well respected in almost all Indigenous cultures. They have equal power, or in some cases a little bit more power than men. Again, the land is something to be cared for. There's really no such thing as profit or money or anything like that. You almost couldn't find two more different groups. But again, they're, a few hundred years ago, they're kind of thrown together in North America here, and there's a lot of conflict that happens because they're not speaking the same language in any way. What about labeling it a genocide, using that word? Is that word powerful? Yeah, that's a heavy word, right? When you say this is a genocide, Genocide is not a term to be casually thrown around, right? And it's not a term that Canadians are used to hearing inside their own country or with relation to their own country. And so many people might react, might push that away as well, right? Because it's such a, you know, people will say, oh yeah, okay, there was some discrimination, yes. There was some racism, yeah, okay, fine, we can deal with that. But when you pull out the G word, that's different, right? That word has a lot of power, and a lot of people are like, couldn't be, right? Because again, it's a heavy word, and it might have to do with education as well, right? Because when we think of genocide, we think of the Holocaust, right? Or we think of Rwanda. And none of those genocides, even though those are both genocides, they don't kind of fit the same pattern as what's happened here in Canada. And so people might not understand the difference or what a genocide is and might want to reject it for that reason too. Okay, you want to take a little break?
Sure.
Okay, let's take 10. We'll come back and we'll just talk quickly about those last two questions. And then I have some video for you. Video. All right.
But in a way, like, is it really respecting, or you just want to sound or look like you're nice to them?
Right, and that's a good question. So for online people, just so you're aware of what's happening, the question came up here about, you see lots of, we have this kind of very difficult history with Indigenous people here in Canada, and yet, in spite of that history, we seem to have totem poles and Indigenous artwork all around Vancouver. And the question is that respectful? Are we sort of just appropriating their culture and making a profit off it while doing nothing for the people themselves? Is this, is this meaningful? Is it respectful? Do people mean what they say? And that's a pretty complicated, that's a complicated question. I think to some degree we probably, it's kind of lip service. Like we say it, but we don't really mean it, or we don't really do anything. So it's like, yes, we'll put up this totem pole. Isn't this amazing? These Indigenous people are great, but then that's the end of it, right? Like no more sort of Indigenous engagement or activity occurs, right? And so we just kind of either do the thing that we think we're supposed to do, or we kind of appropriate their art because, especially in this part of the world, Indigenous art is pretty remarkable, right? It's beautiful, right? And so we've kind of taken it and turned it into part of the character of British Columbia and the way we kind of market ourselves as a tourist destination. But again, does that, have we done anything else? So yeah, that's a good observation. It's a complicated question, and it probably depends on a lot of other variables. Yeah. If you go to the Museum of Anthropology, which is on the UBC campus as well, have you been or seen it? You've seen it. If you go there, unfortunately, they're doing seismic upgrades, so it's kind of partially under construction, but you can still go. If you go, the Museum of Anthropology is a partnership between the Indigenous people of the area and the university itself. And so a lot of the artifacts there are curated in a way that is respectful to Indigenous people, and Indigenous people have some say over the kind of preservation and the telling of their own history. And so sometimes Indigenous people will borrow things from the museum for certain rituals or celebrations, and then they'll bring them back. And so that museum has a much more, is approaching things in a much sort of more progressive way. So
But if they have the artifacts and the indigenous, so who owns the artifacts? Is it still under the, does the museum own it, or is it still under the indigenous people who own it too?
yeah, that's a good question. It probably depends on the way it probably works, and I don't know for sure. Most museums kind of own their, unless something is on loan from another museum, they kind of own their museum or own their collections. In some cases, some cultures are pushing for things to be repatriated, so to be given back to the original culture. Some of that has happened, but museums really don't like to let go of their collections, right? Because a museum with no collection is just an empty building, right? So they're very hesitant to do that. At Museum of Anthropology, I don't know for sure. I suspect some of it is owned by the museum, some of it is owned by Indigenous people, but the museum kind of acknowledges that, this is all your stuff, right? These are artifacts of your people, and we are, we've come into the possession of them, and we're going to try and preserve them and keep them so that, your culture is preserved, but also that others can come and learn and enjoy, which I think is important to Indigenous people as well. So I think, I think that Indigenous people are not kind of hostile to the idea of a museum or a cultural center, as long as they have a meaningful role in being able to structure it in a way that makes sense to them, right? So it's it's not, you know, a bunch of white people studying their culture from the outside. It's actually a collaborative thing. And I think at Museum of Anthropology it actually is. Yeah. Yeah. So it's definitely worth, you know, it's a bit of a bus ride out if you take I think the 84. The 84 will go all the way out there. But it's worth walking around. It's pretty cool. And actually, if this wasn't COVID, I would actually take you to it. I've taken classes there, I think twice already. And so we'd go there if this was like
We can still go there.
normal time.
It's
You can still go there.
It is still
I don't want to take you there because A, the college probably wouldn't let me, and B, I wouldn't want to make you go somewhere that you didn't have to go, and then somebody gets sick, and then it's kind of my fault, and I'd feel awful, and so, yeah. So we're not going. But if this was a normal time, we would go and see it, because it's definitely worth.
Yeah, like no, you can still like let people decide like if they want to go or not.
I can, but it probably wouldn't fly. But I would love to go. I would love to go. I enjoy it. Every time I go, I enjoy it.
Is it like the building where they have like the whale skeleton?
No, that's another building. I don't know UBC. There's a dinosaur one? Oh, is it like a natural history thing or a but?
The skeleton.
I think they do. As I said,
I think that's one of the biggest, like the one that everyone was kind of like talking about because they had like real bones and stuff.
yeah. Again, I don't know UBC very well because I didn't actually go there, but yeah, I know they have that too. But it's definitely worth the trip if you have some spare time. It's pretty cool. Although, I will admit I am a bit of a museum nerd, so you may want to take that into account. Maybe I'll find it much more interesting than you will, but just to tell you. Right. Okay. So we have this ongoing legacies of Canadian genocide thing, and we said, where's my little thing here? We said that, that Canada's treatment of First Nations people in the past and present should be understood as a cultural genocide, right? And so I think that's kind of the conclusion, and the premises that we came up with was that indeed this is the definition of what a genocide is according to the United Nations, and the Canadian government has kind of done these things, right? They have checked the boxes. Again, whether they intended to do it, although it seems like they did, or whether they successfully did it, they didn't, doesn't much matter, right? But the actions are there, right? The acts that make up a genocide are there. Why might people want to reject this argument? Well, maybe a couple of reasons, right? Genocide's a powerful term, and people have a strong reaction to that, right? Maybe people might misunderstand what genocide is, right? They might think about the Holocaust or Rwanda, and since a Canadian genocide doesn't quite look like either of those things, people might reject the idea that one's happened. And then there's the idea of privilege, right? The idea that people might not really be interested in talking about this. It might be uncomfortable. They might feel guilty about it, or angry about it, or defensive about it. Or they might just not want to deal with it, right? And that's kind of the textbook definition of privilege, is that if things don't affect you, you can just ignore them, right? And so if racism towards Indigenous people, if you're not an Indigenous person, you can just ignore it and go on with your life, right? And so that's part of what privilege is. If you're an Indigenous person, you don't really get to ignore that, right? It's kind of in your face. And so, there are some reasons why people might want to reject this. Whoops. I didn't mean to show you that. What are some of the consequences of believing this argument? If we believe Pamela's argument that this is a cultural genocide, this is what Canada did, what might be a consequence of believing that argument?
They have to do something in the government that, in a way, compensate what had happened, and not make it happen again in the future to the new generation.
Yeah. You might actually have to do something, right? If you believe that a genocide has occurred in Canada, we might actually have to do something, right? We might actually have to try to fix the issue and bring equality and justice, like Kang had mentioned, right? What else? What else might be consequences of believing this argument?
They're acknowledged. Is acknowledged in the society, and they're not forgotten.
Right. Maybe people might acknowledge their experience and presence a little more, right? Maybe maybe it might feel better for Indigenous people if people, even if we just took the step, the education step, right? That people know what happened and accept that this horrible thing has happened to these people, right? It's a small step, doesn't really change that much, but maybe even that is good, right? Even just people knowing and being aware of what the history is. And again, increasingly that is the case, right? I think it's very significant that when I asked you about Indian residential schools, almost all of you raised your hands and that you had heard about them. But if you'd gone back to my social studies class in junior high or high school and asked us if we knew about them, nobody would have raised their hand because they weren't teaching us about that at the time. So this is good news, right? Particularly for a bunch of international students who haven't really been in Canada that long, and yet you all know about it. That's good news, right? That means that education is happening, people are learning, people are acknowledging, right? And it's a first step. What are maybe some consequences of not believing this argument?
You will become ignorant.
Ignorance? What's that?
I order punishments keep going.
Yeah, these things continue to happen, right? These things continue to happen.
You don't believe that you're preventing basically reconciliation of Indigenous people who are apart.
Yeah, you're preventing any sort of reconciliation. You can't solve the problem, right? If you can't admit a problem exists, it cannot be solved, right? If your roof is leaking and you don't look at it and you're like, no, it's not happening, my roof isn't leaking, you're never going to fix the roof, right? You have to acknowledge that a problem exists first, then you can solve it. But if people won't acknowledge it, you can't fix it, right? And again, that's why, in part, not entirely, but in part, that's why, when you hear about, say, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and some people come up and say, oh, well, all lives matter. It's like, no, you're missing the point, right? Yes, all lives matter. However, you're shutting down the point they're trying to make, right? They're trying to make a point that Black Americans are disadvantaged in that country, and they are disadvantaged in a number of different ways. And so here they're pointing out their interactions with police and police brutality and deaths in police custody. They're trying to bring attention to that, and you're saying, oh, but all lives matter. Yes, however, you're missing the point, right? You're not kind of paying attention to what they want you to pay attention to. And again, if you can't admit that problem, it never gets fixed, right? And that's why, when people say things like all lives matter, some people kind of blow up and lose their marbles, right? Because again, they're trying to teach you something. The movement is trying to get you to understand something, and people are saying, they're rejecting it and saying, oh no, all lives matter. It's like, yes, they do, but there's a message here, right? There's something they're trying to get you to pay attention to, and you're missing the point, right? So again, you can't fix things if you don't acknowledge there's a problem in the first place. And so, yeah, that's a consequence of not believing it. If we don't believe that this is the case, then maybe we don't do anything to fix it, right? Yeah. So, yeah, if we believe this, maybe we can take steps to repair the relationship. If we don't, nothing changes. Same, right? And again, for people in the dominant group, whatever, right? Same is just fine. But for indigenous people, not going to be very happy, right? More discrimination and racism is not what anyone wants. Okay, let me see. I'll just do this really quickly since it's already on the screen. What does the author suggest to help reconcile the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians? So the author here is calling on Indigenous Canadians to, pardon me, to step up, right? To set the agenda and start working to repair the relationship. And again, this is often what happens with minoritized groups. We encountered this with the women's suffrage movement. Often the minoritized groups have to do the work, right? And it's not fair. They shouldn't have to. They didn't do anything wrong in order to create this inequality. But unfortunately, usually it falls to them to do the work. We saw this with Adam Pearson too, right? With his facial disfigurement. It kind of became up to him to sort of reach out to the community and get them to accept them, right? It's not supposed to be his job to do that, but again, unfortunately, minoritized groups often have to do the work. And so Pamela is saying just that. We've got to step up because if you hadn't guessed already, she's an Indigenous woman. She's saying we have to stand up. We have to tell people what we want. We have to tell people what the path forward is, right? We have to take the action. We can't wait for, Justin Trudeau to save us, even though he promised to do so when he got elected. He didn't really do anything. No, he didn't. There was a lot of talk. There was a lot of talking moistly. No, I'm just kidding. There was a lot of talk going into the election, but not much action has come from it, unfortunately. And Pamela is also calling for a full-scale review of federal and provincial laws and policies, right, to make sure that they're in alignment with UNDRIP. Do you know what that is? United Nations something. United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so that's another thing, just like the convention, the Genocide Convention, where the UN defined what a genocide was. Here they define what the rights of Indigenous peoples in any part of the world are. And so that's what Pamela is calling for. So very quickly here, again, we've had a pretty bad relationship between non-Indigenous Canadians, the Canadian government, and Indigenous Canadians for a few hundred years now, right? And Indigenous people have been traumatized and brutalized in this relationship. It's an abusive marriage is what this relationship is, right? And unfortunately, the Canadian government and non-Indigenous Canadians represent the abuser, right? And again, when this happens for decades, there are kind of echoes or ripples that go through generations, right? It doesn't just end when you close the residential schools. These traumas keep going. And so if you look at some stats, because again, statistics help us to see societal level patterns, you can see here unemployment rate for Indigenous peoples the employment rate, 62%, as opposed to 75% of non-Indigenous populations. So more people who could be in the workforce that are Indigenous, for some reason, are not, right? If you look at their incomes, the amount of money they make, non-Indigenous people on average, well, at the median anyway, is $27,000, but a full $7,000 a year less for Indigenous Canadians, right? So much for those tax write-offs.
Median?
Yeah,
In the middle?
yeah. So
20,000 is not enough to survive.
no, it's not. It's below the poverty line. Yeah. So more Indigenous people and Indigenous kids are living in poverty, right? 30% of Indigenous population don't have a high school diploma or equivalent, compared to 12% for non-Indigenous counterparts. So if you don't have a high school diploma, what can you do? Get a job. Lots of jobs? No. Yeah, once upon a time, a high school diploma was all you needed, right? My dad only has a high school diploma. That's all he's got. And again, when he was entering the workforce, that was still okay, right? But can't do that anymore. A high school diploma doesn't get you anything, and not having a high school diploma is like you don't even have the bare minimum, right? You don't have anything basically. And so that's a big deal when a lot of these when 30% of these kids don't manage to finish high school. Ding, 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 alarm bell, right? Alarm bells should be going off. Even the 12% for non-Indigenous kids is not great, right? It should be 0, right? We don't want to send anyone out of we don't want anyone to not finish high school, because you have no prospects. If you have not finished high school, you have no prospects. And so the fact that, as I say, 12% is bad enough, but 30% is big trouble, right? Massively more than Indigenous or than non-Indigenous Canadians, and that's a huge issue. And that's going to contribute to that $20,000 median income, right? You're not going to make a lot of money with no high school diploma, right? Have a look at health. The UN measures, the UN kind of measures the quality of life of countries in a very rough way with this Human Development Index. And so they very quickly look at life expectancy as a measure of health, so how long people in your country live on average. They look at education, so they look at literacy rate, what percentage of your population is literate or can read and write. And they look at your per capita income to see kind of how developed your economy is. And so they take all these together, they do a mathematical calculation, and they get a number. And I think it's a number, it's like out of 1. So if you've got like a 0.97, fantastic. If you've got a 0.42, trouble, right? So here you'll see that Canada and the US are 7th and 8th in the world in their Human Development Index, which is not bad. It would be nice to see Canada a little bit higher, but
I think it's number 1 and number 2 now. Yeah.
no, we're not.
Yeah, I read it like somewhere like it's number 2 now.
Really? Okay, that's good news. Unless you're an Indigenous person, of course, because as an Indigenous person, you basically live in an entirely different country, right? Your Human Development Index for you is much lower. So their life expectancies are lower, their per capita incomes are lower, their literacy rates are significantly lower, right? They're 33rd and 31st in the world. They're effectively living in a different country within our borders, right? Is that okay?
I'm not gonna lie, like, that's better than like, that's really good right now. Like it's 33 or 31.
Well, yeah, it would be, well, that would be good if the rest of the country was 33 or 31 too, but it ain't, right? Why am I living at number 2, and why are Indigenous people living at 31? Is that fair?
It says that it's not number 2 here. Number 1 is Norway, number 2 is Australia. Canada's not even.
It's not top 10.
Yeah,
It's not top 10.
anymore.
No? So read off this is the most recent one?
2019.
Okay, who's number 1? Norway, I believe that. Next? Switzerland, I believe that.
Ireland.
Ireland? Oh, good for Ireland, okay.
Germany.
Germany, okay.
Hong Kong.
Hong-
Australia. Iceland.
Hong Kong, Australia, Iceland,
Sweden.
Sweden,
Singapore, Netherlands.
Singapore, Netherlands.
That's the top 10.
Whew. We're not even in the top 10 anymore.
Yeah, I think I read some fake news.
You read some fake news. Well, either that or you two are reading fake news, but those make sense. The countries you name, I believe are there, right? But again, Indigenous people are basically not living in the same country, right? Look at the poverty rate here. So this is so usually where they set the poverty rate, it depends. There's a bunch of different measures. It definitely depends on the country you live in, because $20,000 a year is not enough to live in Canada, but if you're in, a very poor country, $20,000 a year might be quite a bit. So it depends on the country you're in. But in Canada, 11% of the population live below the poverty rate. So that means they don't have enough money for food, shelter, and clothing. Okay? They just even basic food, shelter, and clothing, they cannot afford it. 11% of people in Canada live below that margin. But for people of color, 22% of people of color live below the poverty line, as opposed to only 9% of white people. So again, white people are slightly underrepresented in that poverty group. People of color are overrepresented, right? And for every dollar earned by a white man, a woman of color will only earn 55 or 56 cents, right? Huh? No. Look at criminal justice here. So this is incarceration rate, so the percent of your population that is in prison. And so for Canada, our average is 54 people per 100,000. Spoiler alert, the US is way more than that. They've got a lot of people in prison. The war on drugs has been very effective in that regard. It's put a lot of people in jail. So for our country here, 54 of every 100,000 people is in jail currently. But Indigenous men, for instance, they make up only 3% of Canada's population. 3% of Canada's population are Indigenous men, but 26% of the people in prison are Indigenous men. So they are super overrepresented in prison, right? There's way more than you would think. For people coming into prison, 25% of people, of men are Indigenous coming into the prison system. Even more so with women. Indigenous women are much more likely to wind up in prison than any other group. And youth, look at youth. 41% of young people who go to prison for whatever reason, 41% of them are Indigenous.
Is it like 19, 20 years old?
Yeah, I think they would probably, yeah. No, it would probably be youth admissions. It's probably like under 18. So people who are put into like a juvenile correctional facility or something like that. Yeah, 41. They're 3% of the population in Canada, and they're 25, 36, 41% of prison admissions. Alarm bells, right? Ding, 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 ding. Something's wrong, right? They are super overrepresented in prison. Something is seriously wrong, right? Yeah, so here's some more stats. Here, life expectancy. So if you're a Canadian woman, you can expect to live about 83 years. If you're a Canadian man, you can expect to live about 79 years on average. But look at for Indigenous men and women, significantly lower. For Indigenous men, they're a full 9 years lower, almost 9 years lower than non-Indigenous men. Same thing with women, right? They're a good 8 years. They've got 8 years less of life. That seems like a big difference, right? Do you want to live to be 75 or do you want to live to be 83? 8 years is a long time. Think about where you were 8 years ago. Were you 10 or 11 years old? That's a long time to not live, right? Some more here. Suicide rates among First Nations youth are 5 to 6 times the national average. Inuit youth, Inuit are the First Nations people who live in the sort of high north sort of thing, 10 times more likely to commit suicide than the national average. And you see these statistics played out when you talk about depression or anxiety or other mental health issues, drug and alcohol addiction, living in poverty. All of these things are far more likely to show up in Indigenous populations than in non-Indigenous populations. And again, that should be an alarm bell, right? Because little changes in distribution is fine, but when you see big gaps, something's wrong, right? There's something happening that we should investigate, right? Yeah, and I think we kind of intuitively know why these things are happening, right? Why do we see these kind of statistical patterns that we do? What's going on? What is the reason for Indigenous people being far more likely to live in poverty, to make less money, to not graduate high school, to wind up in prison, to have drug and alcohol issues? Why are these things happening?
They're in several minoritized groups.
In some cases, they definitely are.
Also in regulations, especially from the past, have affected them in generations.
Yeah, we have generational trauma happening, right? So if you think about those kids that went to residential school, they were taken from their families when they were very young. They went to a school where they received no love, no care, abuse, brutalization. They finish school, if they survive, they finish school, they get out, and what do? They go and create families of their own, right? They get married or they have kids or whatever, but they don't know how to be parents because they were taken from their parents. And instead, what they got were church officials who abused them. And so what happens? Well, in many cases, that abuse continues. And again, this isn't specific to Indigenous people. This happens with any human being that you do this with. The abuse will continue often. And so, yeah, we have this intergenerational trauma that is still playing itself out, right? What else do we have? Why else are these patterns existing? Why else are these patterns existing?
It's harder to get a job.
Well, yeah, that might be part of it, right? We have stereotypes and racism and discrimination, right? They may find it harder to get employment because of those stereotypes. We saw it with the resume experiment, right? Of black-sounding names versus white-sounding names. I don't know if that same experiment has been replicated in Canada, maybe with some stereotypically Indigenous names. But do you think we would see a similar pattern? I think, yeah. I think we would. I think we would see a similar pattern. So, yeah, they face discrimination in society, in hiring. What else?
Different, like they have different laws that apply to them. So if you're treated as not part of the group and you have to fight for your rights and everything, it's kind of like minorities who they accept who they are as well, so they act that way.
Yeah, they have.
Prison.
Yeah, they have an entirely different set of laws that are applying to them still, right? The Indian Act still exists, it's still in force. None of it applies to me whatsoever, but it does structure the lives of some people in Canada, right? And there also might be some internalized oppression happening here as well, right? The idea that, if you hear enough messages that your people are lazy or drunk or, no good or whatever, then you kind of start believing that. And Indigenous people have been taught that in Canada for a long time. And those things are difficult to overcome as well, right? Those stereotypes continue to persist, right, even today. Okay, I'm going to leave it there because we're almost out of time. Tomorrow, we'll just quickly recap this, and then I have a video to show you, which I hope you'll find interesting, but we'll see. Papers are due tomorrow. Please email me your paper when it's done. So put it into Word or Pages or whatever you want. Email it to me, and then I will try to mark them on the weekend. I got a lot of marking to do. But until then, I will let you go. Have a nice rest of the afternoon, everybody. And I'll see you tomorrow, Friday.